We've already seen one form of Roman games, or ludi, in the shape of the ludi skyniki, the theatrical games. But the ludi skyniki weren't the only form of ludi at Rome, and they weren't even the most popular. One of the most significant forms of ludic entertainment at Rome were the ludi circenses, the circus games. Now, by circus we shouldn't understand what the term comes to mean, particularly in a European context at a later period of time. Rather, circus here refers to the circuit that chariots raced around. So the ludi circenses are specifically chariot racing games. The context in which the ludi circenses took place are indeed very, very similar to those of the ludi skyniki. Particularly, they were festive contexts, holidays, religious festivals, at which ludi weren't necessarily the central part of the festivities, but could be attached to, as an addition, as part of a celebration, in theory to any particular festival that the Romans were celebrating. Although we do know that just as with the ludi skyniki, there were some particular festivals that ludi circenses were attached to from a very, very early period in Roman history. And they're the same 5 festivals that we know the ludi skyniki were part of. And from their early history, it does seem that ludi circenses and ludi skyniki were often held in tandem. So the festivals of the ludi romani, the ludi florales, the ludi apollinares, the ludi megalenses and the ludi plebii are, from Roman sources, said to be the festivals at which ludi circenses and ludi skyniki first took root. And as with the ludi skyniki, the ludi circenses have a very important and prominent part to play in the political careers of aristocratic Romans, particularly early on in their careers at the lower rungs of the so-called cursus honorum, the circuit of officers, or the ladder of officers that Roman aristocrats with a political ambitions would seek to climb. So, as with the ludi skyniki, it was these junior magistrates known as aediles who were largely responsible during the Republican period for supporting, for organising, and to some extent, out of both public and private, their own pockets, funding the ludi circenses. It's worth noting just at this early point, although this is certainly something we'll return to in more detail, that gladiatorial games and games of the arena more generally typically aren't referred to as ludi by the Romans, but rather with an alternative set of terms, the most prominent of which is munera. I'll come to that a little bit later, but it's an important indication that the ludi circenses and ludi skyniki, as I've mentioned, were often celebrated in tandem and structurally operated in very, very similar ways, both in terms of the context for celebration, but also in terms of how they were supported and their embedding within the political structures of Rome, whereas arena games do develop in a somewhat different way, as we'll see shortly. One of the most distinctive things about the ludi circenses at Rome, and as the empire developed and as chariot racing was adopted in various provincial capitals elsewhere in the empire throughout the Roman world, is that it was essentially a team-based sport. Perhaps the best contemporary analogy to think of, it's not a perfect one, but is professional cycling. Those competing in the ludi circenses were part of initially 4 factions or teams. Factiones is the Latin term used of them, who had their team colours and were in fact known by the distinctive colours of their faction: red, white, blue and green. At various points in Roman history there were attempts to add further factiones, new teams, but essentially it was those 4 factions throughout Roman history that are the most prominent, the most consistent and the best known. As with other ludic entertainments, and indeed as with the arena games as we'll see, there was quite a substantial industry that developed around and behind the ludi circenses. The charioteers, and in fact the factiones, the factions as a whole, were professional. They were owned by businessmen who ran the factiones for a profit. One way of thinking about this is to consider the owners of the factiones as subcontractors to the aediles, the magistrates, and at a later point the imperial officials who were charged with organising the ludi circenses and would hire the various factiones to compete in the games. So the revenue that the factiones rely upon is the hiring costs for them to compete in the games and the prize money, which I'll discuss in a few moments. Because, of course, there was no gate charge, there was no attendance fee for the people to come to the ludi. Admission was free. And this is one, not the only, but one of the reasons that the ludi circenses were extremely popular in Rome. In fact, the ludi circenses were far and away the most popular form of entertainment at Rome throughout all of antiquity. We know this, as I'll discuss in a moment, not simply from the capacities of the circuses themselves, the seating capacities and how many there were, but from the frequency with which circus games are discussed, celebrated, sometimes questioned and contested in the sources, compared, for instance, to the ludi skyniki or even arena games. And some of the things that do emerge from the sources about the ludi circenses, reflecting upon the circus games, is that there was clearly fanatical support for the different teams or factions competing. We have references to violence breaking out among fans at the circus. We have references to gambling and what seems to be a very deep and widespread, almost gambling industry around the circus racing. And because of this, ludi circenses become associated, certainly in some aristocratic sources, with a kind of a slightly dark and thuggish reputation. This reputation, from an aristocratic perspective, is perhaps furthered by the status of the charioteers themselves. A charioteer, aurigus, to use the most common term for a charioteer, aurigi plural, were essentially slaves. They were of slave status. They were owned by the owners of the factiones and competed on their behalf. Yet at the same time, despite being of lowly slave status, charioteers were in the public eye and through their achievements in the circus could garner great fame and what we would call today, in fact, celebrity. We know this from a fairly large number of inscriptions, graffiti and other sources that discuss and celebrate the achievements of the charioteers themselves. And this relationship between lowly slave status and high profile could be seen from particularly a traditional Roman aristocratic point of view as a deep contradiction. Of course, Roman aristocrats themselves have a vested interest in maintaining their own status and maintaining their own profile, and to see those of a demonstrably lower status socially than themselves achieving a popularity and a celebration among the people which might in some cases rival those of the aristocrats themselves, might be seen as threatening or at least a cause of anxiety, and some of that is reflected in the sources that we have, and is a similar, or creates a similar sort of ambivalence on the part of the Roman upper classes towards the ludi circenses that we've already discussed in relation to the ludi skyniki and the status of actors and other theatre professionals, of course. But there are also some other sources connected to the ludi circenses which are suggestive of a darker side, perhaps, to the violent nature of the circus. For instance, one particular primary source are the so-called defictiones, sometimes translated into English as curse tablets, although defictiones means probably more accurately something like binding tablets. These are small tablets, often inscribed on soft metals such as lead, but probably also inscribed on other surfaces such as wax and wood that no longer survive to us, that seek to gain, through calling upon the gods or other powers that might assist, some advantage in the ludi over one of the opposing sides. Now I say opposing sides here, but I'm not assuming that these are texts that were actually written or artifacts that were used by the charioteers themselves. It's entirely possible here that the fictiones we have from a circus context were employed by the fans that, as I've mentioned, were not just extremely passionate, from what we can gather at least from the primary sources, about their particular teams and their favourite charioteers, but perhaps also in some cases, given the prominence of gambling around the circus, had a monetary interest in the outcome of some of the races. And when we look at these texts, we can see some of the violence associated with the circus reflected in the nature of the documents. And I give you one example here that calls upon the daimon, it calls upon the spirits to not simply stop the opposing team from winning, the opposing faction from winning, but to torture and kill the horses of the opposing factions, the greens and the whites in this case, and completely kill and crush the drivers of those factiones. And this is perhaps indicative not just of a culture of violence around the circus, but of the violent nature of the games themselves. As I've mentioned, charioteers could achieve quite a degree of celebrity. They could also, unlike most slaves, actually accrue a decent amount of wealth if they were successful, because it was traditional that part of the prize money, most of which would go to the owner of the winning factio in a particular race, could be shared with the charioteer himself, so that charioteers, despite being slave, who won races repeatedly, could start to accrue quite a degree of wealth themselves. And this too blurs the boundaries between what was typically assumed as typical or appropriate for slaves. And one way of looking at this perhaps is to see that being a charioteer provided opportunities which weren't typically available in Roman society to those of slave status. However, the other side of this is that the ludi circenses themselves were extremely dangerous, and perhaps more dangerous even than we might consider chariot racing to be. We know from the sources that accidents were extremely common during circus games, and in fact we perhaps get a little bit of a sense that this was sometimes part of the attraction for those who followed the sport, that they were looking for the accidents and the spills. Some of the equipment of the charioteers and the chariots themselves could even be seen to be increasing the likelihood of danger. Unlike in some 20th and even 21st century films that depict Roman chariot racing, you shouldn't think of the chariot cab as being the sort of solid vehicle that you might assume. Instead, essentially, charioteers are balanced on a fairly flimsy wicker board, which is attached to the axle of the chariot and then to the horses by the various equipment. So there was very little protection available for a charioteer should the chariot crash or he fall off for one reason or another. And as we'll see in a few moments, even the circuit of the circus itself seems designed to increase the likelihood of spills. It's very, very difficult. Indeed, at the end of the day, it's probably impossible to get very accurate demographic figures on charioteers. But given that these charioteers very often were celebrated and they were successful and they could accrue some wealth on some occasions, at least among the most successful, we are fortunate enough to have a number of funerary inscriptions about charioteers. And where those funerary inscriptions give us a hint about the ages of the deceased charioteers, it does seem that there's very, very few, if any, that live beyond 30. And bear in mind that these are typically the more successful charioteers as well, those who have managed to gain some fame and gain perhaps some wealth. So it's difficult to really generalise from that and say flat out that the life expectancy of a charioteer was typically under the age of 30, but we do have a strong sense that charioteers had a high likelihood of a short life and dying young. But whether or not the likelihood of accidents and violence in the circus was part of the attraction for the fans, it's undoubtedly true that ludicrocenses were hugely popular at Rome. We can see this in simply the number of circuses that were built at Rome from a reasonably early date, and the Circus Maximus being the earliest and the most prominent, and I'll spend a little bit of time discussing the Circus Maximus in a moment, but also fairly early on in the 3rd century BCE, the Circus Flaminius was added, a fairly high capacity venue itself, and circuses continued to be built in Rome in the 1st century CE and beyond. Perhaps one of the best known being the large circus that was in the site now occupied by the Vatican, the Circus Vaticanus, that was built probably in the 50s or 60s CE. And there were many others, and of course there were many others around the Roman world in key cities and sometimes even in small provincial venues. This was an incredibly popular form of ludic entertainment. And the earliest of the circus venues, the Circus Maximus at Rome, becomes essentially the model for all other circuses that follow. The Romans themselves considered the Circus Maximus to date effectively to the foundation of Rome itself. The epic poet Ennius, writing at the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, for instance, talks in his poem, the Annales, about Romulus celebrating chariot races at the site of the Circus Maximus. Now, whether or not it's quite that early, certainly the Circus Maximus is the first of the circuses at Rome. Possibly also the largest, at least in the form that it is developed or finally developed in later years. It holds a very, very prominent position in Rome as well, of course, between the Palatine and the Aventine hills. It's a large space, initially, of course, in a natural shallow valley space, which encouraged the use of that particular site for the purpose, but very, very soon becoming monumentalized and built up to the point that at its height, and scholarly assessments of capacity vary, but it's thought that at its height, the capacity for the crowd was somewhere between 150,000 at the lower estimates to as much as 250,000, as some scholars at the upper estimates have suggested, that could be accommodated in the cavea area, in the seating area of the circus. And the distinctive form of the Circus Maximus, as I've mentioned, becomes the model for other circuses at Rome and throughout the Roman world. And there's perhaps 3 key parts of the structure of the circus that I draw attention to. One is the carceres, the starting gates of, or barriers, is perhaps a more literal translation, which aren't actually on the main course itself, but are at the flat or the flattish end, or one flattish end of the circus, from which the chariots move out, but rapidly narrow into the lanes of the circuit proper. And this is perhaps the first point at which the possibilities of collisions and accidents occur. The chariots then race around a central spine, the spina, down the barrier, down the middle of the circus, turning at the sharp ends of the spina, which were known as the metai, the turning posts. And as you can see, the turns themselves are very sharp indeed. And it's thought that one of the things that the turns created was, again, the opportunity for accidents and violence. And there's maybe a little bit of an echo in some of the sources that some of the most sought after seats in the circus were near each meta, because that is where you're likely to see the most accidents. And not only does the Circus Maximus become the model for other circuses throughout the Roman world, but we have multiple depictions in mosaics and other forms of illustration of circus games in one form or another, and sometimes of whole circuses in operation, which is very suggestive of the extreme popularity of these kinds of events. So as we move on to look at one further and perhaps a much better known form of entertainment at Rome, the arena games, it's important to remember that whilst we might most clearly associate Roman entertainments with gladiators and so on, the events of the circus seem to have dwarfed the popularity of other ludic entertainments. It's games of the arena or gladiatorial games that we today perhaps associate most immediately with Roman forms of entertainment. But it's interesting and important to be aware that the development of arena games and even their place in Roman society, right down to the terms used for these forms of entertainments, differ very slightly from the ludi circenses and indeed the ludi scaenici that we've already looked at. The term most commonly used for gladiatorial or arena games, for instance, isn't ludi, it's munera. The term munera or munus in the singular can mean gifts, which might be a significant meaning in the context, as we'll see, and can also sometimes be understood as duties. Both of those senses, I think, have some relevance in the meanings and certainly even the historical development of arena and gladiatorial games at Rome. Now, it is true that on occasion, and particularly in later antiquity, the Romans themselves can use the term ludi, and particularly ludi amphitheatrales, amphitheatrical games, to refer to games of the arena, and there they're drawing upon the analogy with ludi scaenici and ludi circenses. But that is not the most common way of referring to them, and it's useful to remember this because I think some of the distinctions between gladiatorial arena games and the ludi scaenici and circenses, that these distinctions draw to the surface. And the meaning of gladiator itself is fairly clear. Essentially it means sword man, because the gladius refers to a particular weapon, only one of the weapons employed in some gladiatorial combats, the gladius, which also incidentally, and perhaps importantly, is the common short sword used by Roman soldiers. As with the ludi scaenici, the Romans themselves suggest that gladiatorial combat specifically has origins in earlier Etruscan practices. Some Roman sources talk about Etruscans pitting prisoners of war against each other in combat. But we know from the Roman context itself that their first gladiatorial combats seem to have arisen in a funerary context. And this is the first, I think, interesting difference between the development of the ludi scaenici and ludi circenses, and gladiatorial games and later arena games. This difference in funerary context as opposed to the festive context of the ludi scaenici and circenses. Roman sources give a traditional date, and here again I'm drawing on that late 1st century BCE historian Livy, a traditional date of 264 BCE as the first gladiatorial combat at Rome, at the funeral of a significant republican figure Junius Brutus, at which 3 pairs of gladiators fought. Now, in this context, it's interesting to think about the potential meanings of the term munera here. That can the gladiatorial combat be seen as gifts, offerings, we might say, to the deceased, or, and it could be both, of course, and or duties performed by the mourners, and particularly the family of the deceased, to the dead, in this case, Junius Brutus. The other interesting aspect of this story of early development of gladiatorial games is the way in which the prominence of gladiatorial combat and the nature of gladiatorial combat in a funerary context, an aristocratic funerary context, and it is important to be specific about that aristocratic context, starts to expand. So, for instance, if you think of the funeral of Junius Brutus in 264, where 3 pairs of gladiators apparently fought, and we move forward a couple of centuries, almost a couple of centuries, to 65 BCE, with the funeral of the father of Julius Caesar, where again gladiators were fighting. There we have reference to the number of 320 pairs of gladiators, and not only was there a much larger number of combats, but the gladiators themselves were decked out in elaborate equipment, and we have references to silver armour and the display of the gladiators and the opulence that was part of the munera of the funerary games. Although still very much in a funerary context, we certainly have this increase in display and expenditure and degree of the gladiatorial games in the funerary contexts. And it does seem that down to the middle of the 1st century BC, around the time of the funeral of the father of Julius Caesar, for instance, gladiatorial combats were still predominantly occurring within those funerary contexts. But over the next 100 or so years, the context for gladiator and eventually arena games changes, develops. This is not to say that they couldn't still occur within aristocratic funerary context, of course, but we start to see gladiatorial games occurring in non-funerary contexts. Essentially, these were standalone games funded by a sponsor, usually referred to as an editor or sometimes a munerator, a giver of the gifts or the duties of the munera, where the entrance, as with most Roman entertainments, would be free, and the motive for putting on these games, and not necessarily and typically not in fact connected with very particular religious festivals, could simply be to make a gesture to the public to garner perhaps popular favour, and so on. And so often we see that gladiatorial and arena games are attached or celebrated on the back of particular achievements and are seen as ways of publicising, perhaps glorifying those particular achievements. Victories, military victories in particular, become an occasion for potentially celebrating gladiatorial games as a way of celebrating and even, as I say, publicising the triumph of the general. So a general would become an editor or a munerator of their gladiatorial games and offer these entertainments to the people in celebration of his victory, and also as a way of garnering further public favour, raising his status and profile and so on. And this is occurring even before the very end of the Republic and the initiation of the Principate under Augustus and the consolidation eventually of rule by emperors. However, it is very much in the early imperial period and sponsored by emperors themselves that this form of gladiatorial and arena entertainments provided to celebrate particular achievements, to mark particular achievements, and offered to the people outside of a funerary context really starts to take off and develop into its fullest form, and perhaps the form that we think of now when we look back to gladiatorial games in the Roman period. So by the 1st century CE, it was typically the emperor himself who was the sponsor, who paid for, who was the editor of the games. Not the person who did the hands-on organising, of course. There were officials appointed to do that, but certainly it was typically the emperor himself who sponsored these games, at least the more elaborate and large-scale ones. One of the largest imperial games in the 1st centuries CE were the games that Trajan celebrated as part of his glorification of the Dacian wars, his victories in Dacia. We have a fair bit of detail conveyed to us about what those games consisted of, although some scholars have doubted the exact numbers that come down to us. We are told, for instance, that 10,000 gladiators took part in the games in 106 CE, and that it was so elaborate that it actually took a full 123 days to complete all of the entertainments. And people could come in and come out as this was going on, but essentially it was a very long season of amphitheatrical games, which would have been hugely expensive to run, of course, and was focused on the celebration of the achievements, and particularly the military achievements, and of course the largesse of the emperor himself. The differences that I've outlined aside, as with Ludi Skyniki and Ludi Circenses, there was a significant industry behind the amphitheatrical and gladiatorial games, and one that takes a similar shape to the Ludi Circenses and the Ludi Skyniki. For instance, there were essentially subcontractors that the Roman officials could hire to put on, and certainly to provide the performers, so to speak, for the games themselves. In particular, there were contractors known as Lanisti who owned and were responsible for schools, as they were called, of gladiators, whom the officials, and in the imperial period under the emperors, these would be the procuratores, whom the emperor enlisted to organise the games. The procuratores would hire the Lanisti to supply the gladiators and the other participants for the games. And I say gladiators and other participants because the events of the arena were actually more various, in fact much more various, than simply gladiatorial combat alone. Even within the context of gladiatorial combat, there was a lot of diversity and variation, and this seems to have been something that the Roman crowd were actually interested in, seeing novelty, seeing variation in the forms that combats took. We have reference from early in the imperial period, from the Augustan period onwards, for instance, to sea battles, mock sea battles being conducted in arenas, these referred to as naumachia, drawing on a Greek term, sea battles in the arena itself. Now, there's a lot of speculation about how this was actually done, given the structures of the arena, and there are some imaginative speculations about how this could have occurred, and how the arena might have been made watertight enough and then filled with water so that ships could float around in it. But we certainly have these references, and this is part of the interest in variation and novelty in the combats themselves. And even in what we might today think of as the more traditional or typical type of one-on-one gladiatorial battles, there was a number of different types of gladiators. I won't go through all of the different types, but I would draw attention to a few, because I'll come back to perhaps the significance of how these types featured, and why these types in particular, a little bit later. For instance, there were a number of different types of gladiators, essentially classified by their equipment, but given terms that often referred to particular ethnic groups or people, such as Samnites, early Italic people that the Romans had struggled with in the earlier Republican period. A Samnite gladiator would be defined by his shield and his sword. Thracian gladiators, or the Thracian type of gladiator, defined by a much smaller shield and a dagger. But there were also some other types that were categorised more by even the decoration of their armour, for instance. Famously, the murmillo, or the murmilones, plural, were the most heavily armoured of the gladiators, and upon their helmet was mounted a depiction of a sea monster, and murmillo itself means sea monster. And the murmilones could often be set to face the retiari, the gladiators who fought with a net and a trident in this kind of mock sea monster versus fisherman and hunter motif. And I would probably think that today we would consider the gladiatorial games as extremely bloody. I mean, influenced by many generations of imaginings of gladiatorial combat, whether it's in books and in theatre, or in later years in film and on television and so on. We'd think of it as an extremely bloody sport, and it's important to remember that it was essentially very much a blood sport. However, there was a number of non-lethal forms that gladiatorial combat took, and often did take. Often early on in a day of gladiatorial or arena games, there would be the so-called pro-lucio, the events that happened before the lucio, or the game itself, which would always be, or typically always be, a non-lethal fighting, either with blunted weapons, which doesn't mean there couldn't be injuries, of course, but fighting with blunted weapons, and never culminating in the death of one of the combatants. Even where the possibility of death was very real, this was formally moderated by an expectation that combatants, should the opportunity arise in the combat to decide whether or not to finish off an opponent, that they would defer, particularly not to the crowd as a whole actually, but specifically to the editor, to the sponsor of the games, or his representative there in the arena. And this is where the famous, in later years, the thumbs up and thumbs down gesture comes into it. Probably not, as we would think of it, a thumbs up or thumbs down. For instance, the terms used are mite, for not killing the gladiator, which literally means something like send him away or let him go, and jugula, which means, as you might guess, cut his throat. And we do have references to a turning of the thumb, not a thumbs up or thumbs down, in Roman sources. And if you match that idea with the terms used, then the gestures are probably something like mite, for let him go, and jugula, for cut his throat. Now, the other interesting aspect of this is the deference to the editor, or the sponsor. And this makes sense in the context of the games, of course, because it's the editor who is paying for the games as a whole, and paying the Lanistae for the gladiatorial combatants. And should any of them die, there is a cost attached to that for the editor himself. So essentially, you're deferring to the sponsor of the games to know whether this expenditure should be exacted. Now, it is true from what we can gather from the sources that the editor did often defer to the broader feeling of the crowd, which also aligns with this idea that gladiatorial games themselves are partly motivated by a desire to accrue popular favour for the editor or the sponsor, the emperor in the imperial context, but wasn't in any ways bound to follow the will of the crowd generally, if indeed there was a consensus among them. And it's been suggested by some scholars that estimates of how many gladiators died in the arena have been exaggerated, because in part gladiators were very expensive to train. They're, to put it bluntly, very costly assets. Alongside this, and part of the reinforcing evidence for this, is we also know that there was a very highly, in Roman terms, extremely highly developed and sophisticated medical support for gladiators, designed to patch them up, to keep them healthy and so on, precisely because they were such valuable assets. So to allow a gladiator to be killed when you have the option to allow him to live and fight another day was a very costly decision indeed. All of that is not to say, and certainly we know this was the case, that gladiators could die in the arena, and how often the option to pause and decide whether or not to strike a fatal blow was available is a very, very difficult question to answer. It's a very bloody entertainment, but perhaps not as bloody as, or at least not as fatal as we might immediately think, to the point that some scholars have argued that more died and life expectancies were shorter for participants in the ludi circenses than they were for gladiators in the arena. Now we should note what I think is probably a fairly obvious connection between gladiatorial and arena games, at least as they develop in the imperial period, and military victory. Not only was the editor, the sponsor of the games, typically putting them on in order to celebrate a specific military victory, his own as general of a military force very often, but as we've seen, in some ways and in some cases, the arena events themselves could enact and maybe reenact certain military engagements. What's more, as I've mentioned, some of the types, not all of them by any means, but some of the types of gladiators who fought, such as the Thracians or the Samnites. There was also a type of gladiator referred to as the Gallus, as the Gaul, evoke enemies of Rome, albeit from perhaps an earlier stage of their history. So that analogy between what's occurring in the arena and the military victories of Rome would have been very apparent, I think, in different ways to the audience as a whole. But it wasn't just gladiators who took part in the amphitheatrical games. Certainly I think it's accurate to look upon the gladiators themselves as maybe the main events of an amphitheatrical entertainment, or a day of amphitheatrical entertainment, but it consisted of far more than this. In fact, to some extent, it starts even before the events of the arena get underway, with a procession to the venue, a pompa to the venue that, from what we can gauge, attracted crowds in itself. Then in the early events of the day, as I've mentioned, these proluciones, these non-lethal battles with blunted or wooden weapons, leading on to and introducing the potentially lethal gladiatorial matches later in the day. But there are other important events that could be introduced into an arena program. Most significantly, perhaps to some extent best known, were executions. And this is an interesting, complex, I think, way in which the events of the arena, the games, have almost a judicial function as well. Perhaps the best known form of execution was ad bestias, the execution where the prisoners are given to beasts to be devoured, although that seems actually in practice to have been quite rare, and much more mundane forms of execution by sword or by garrote or so on were frequently performed. But I'd encourage you to think about how that changes, or how that affects the occasion, what that meanings that might have, to have, usually as a centerpiece at the highest point of the day, at midday, to have those executions as part. Do we see it as part of the entertainment? Do we see it as something else? How does it relate to the broader meanings of arena and gladiatorial games in Roman society? And importantly as well, needs to be remembered that a large number of events, and some very popular events in the arena, didn't pit man against man, but actually pitted man against animal. There was a very specialised type of combatant in the arena known as the bestiarii, the beast hunters or the beast fighters, who took part in events that were called quite simply hunts, venationes, where beasts would be released into the arena, and the bestiarii would fight and kill them. And whatever the scholarly estimates about how often or how many gladiators might have died in the arena, one thing we certainly do know is that very large numbers of animals died in the arena. On the opening day of the Flavian Amphitheatre, the Colosseum as we now refer to it, for instance, we are told that 5,000 beasts were fought and killed in the arena, A whole industry or sub-industry of arena games in itself revolved around the supply of animals to arena games around the Roman world. And there was an interest in a diverse and, if possible, exotic selection of animals to fight in the arena. And it's interesting that many of our depictions of arena games do foreground the various animals and the different types of animals that were used in the arena and killed in the arena as well. So it's a significant part of a potential arena games program. And this even extends to the giving of the animals, who had a very, very short lifespan in the arena themselves, are distinctive and names of one type or another. So the venationes are a very important and prominent part of the arena games program. As with charioteers in the ludi circenses, gladiators themselves, whether bestiarii or other forms of gladiators, were of slave status. Originally, of course, as we've seen, the Romans considered the development of gladiatorial combat to come from the pitting of prisoners of war against each other. And indeed, one of the prominent sources throughout the Roman period, and certainly early, for gladiators was slaves taken in war, but that not exclusively so by any means. And there are even some cases and some ways in which those who were born free could become gladiators, could give up their freeborn status and become gladiators. It's interesting to consider what the incentive might have been in this case, because unambiguously, at least in socio-legal terms, gladiators are slave status. This also includes some who had been stripped of their freeborn status through criminal activities of one type or another. Now, gladiators predominantly were male, but there were some, so we think, female gladiators, deployed very rarely and typically represented as an unusual or even a novelty event. And so evidence for female gladiators is very, very sketchy. We have from the area of Asia Minor one inscription that seems to be, and one depiction of female gladiators, two named as Amazon and Achilleia, obviously evoking female or female versions of heroic and mythic combatants. But how widespread this was, we can't be certain. As well as those who were prisoners of war or became slaves through criminal convictions of one type or another. As I've mentioned, there were some, and we know this, who could voluntarily become gladiators. The reasons for this can be disputed. As I say, it's interesting to think about what the motivation would be. But from what we can gather, these figures might be, for instance, ex-soldiers who were familiar with combat and then lacked employment after leaving the army. There might be ex-slaves who had technically become freed, but again perhaps lacked the resources to make their own way as freed men. And in becoming gladiators, they essentially give up, as I say, their free or their citizen status. One of the things that links all of the performers, let's say, in all of the games that we have discussed, whether ludi, skyniki, circenses or the arena games, is they are considered to be completely devoid of reputation. This term infamus, or referring to these figures in the plural as infames, is recurrent. And again, this is part of this apparent, from an aristocratic point of view, contradiction or tension between their status as slaves, or at the very least being infames, and at the same time being able to accrue quite significant celebrity if they're successful, and even in some cases some wealth. And one other thing we can see, and we can see this very clearly in some of the ways in which gladiators are depicted, in some of the context in which they appear depicted on domestic artefacts and graffiti and so on, is that clearly they were seen as quite charismatic figures. To give one now quite famous example of this, a graffito from the Bay of Naples around Herculaneum depicting gladiators, and not simply depicting gladiators, someone scratching in the wall a scene or a generic scene of gladiators, but quite specific gladiators whom we assume would have been seen performing in the local arena. The inscription that's scratched in with these little drawings refer to these figures by name. Oceanus, a freed man, a winner of 13 matches won, an example in this case of someone who had been a freed man competing in the arena, we would suppose, voluntarily. Arachintus, also a freed man, winner of 9 matches, who lost his bout with Oceanus. And a bout between Severus, a freed man, winner of 13 matches, who lost, and Albanus, a freed man, a left-hander, and you can actually see this if you look carefully at the depictions here, who had won 19 matches and won the bout with Severus. So here we can imagine a fan of the gladiators who has obviously been watching quite closely and paying attention, and as we might say today, keeping the stats of his favourite gladiators, noting them down in maybe an idle moment, scratching them into the wall. Or perhaps this is a little bit of advertising on behalf of the Lanistae, or the editor of the Gladiatorial Games, that is promoting the most recent events, recording it in order to create a bit of hype and a bit of buzz around the arena games. But regardless, it shows quite a close interest and attention in the careers of these figures who were considered to be lacking in any formal status, to be infames. We also see in the many depictions of gladiators, particularly on domestic artefacts such as lamps, such as these terracotta lamps, or bowls or other utensils, that there is an interest, there is perhaps even a certain glamour, as some scholars have suggested, in gladiators from the point of view of the free citizens of Rome who are following and to whom these sorts of games are appealing. And even as the term that I've used repeatedly of arena games suggests, and indeed as the term for all of the Roman games, ludi skyniki, referring to the stage, ludi circenses, referring to the circus or the circuit of the racing themselves. The physical venue for these events is very important. Now, initially with the development of gladiatorial games, specifically in the funerary context, there wasn't a permanent venue. We do have some discussions of the funerals being celebrated in the Roman Forum and the combats being held there, but as the gladiatorial games are being conducted outside of funerary contexts and these non-funerary contexts, initially it seems, perhaps as with the development of theatre, that temporary structures are employed, temporary wooden amphitheatres, with the first stone amphitheatres being established actually slightly later than the first permanent theatre in the Theatre of Pompey. The first amphitheatre seems to have been built, stone amphitheatre seems to have been built in 29 BCE and supported by the first emperor, the Princeps of Rome, Augustus. Amphitheatre, by the way, just comes from a term amphitheatrum, meaning a theatre on both sides, and that's one interesting way of seeing it if you think back to the design of the Roman theatre, essentially, particularly the cavea, the seating area being semicircular. The amphitheatre is really two semicircles together in a circular venue, and of course today the most common model for that, although by no means the earliest, is the Colosseum at Rome. The Colosseum is actually a little bit of a slang term for the venue that develops slightly later than its inauguration. Initially, the Romans would have referred to what we today call the Colosseum as the Flavian Amphitheatre, the Amphitheatrum Flavium, because it was established by, or at least it was initiated and then completed by members of the Flavian dynasty of emperors. Opened in 80 CE, it has a capacity of roughly 50,000. And just to pause there and compare it to the potential, at least, capacity of the Circus Maximus, you can see there one of the pieces of evidence that's often used to argue that circus games are far, far more popular because they could hold 3 or more times the amount of people that the amphitheatres could hold. That, of course, is debatable, particularly since, as we've seen with the example of the games held by Trajan in 106, you could hold amphitheatrical games over a quite long period of time, because unlike the Ludi Scaenici or the Ludi Circenses, they're not necessarily bound to the very fixed dates of particular religious festivals. So Trajan can hold his games for 123 days if he wants to. So some of these questions of popularity and one entertainment being more popular than another are very difficult to be certain about. The Colosseum itself, of course, is a very complex architectural structure which has drawn a lot of interest. And in fact, there's many things we still don't know or can't understand about the workings of the fabric of the Colosseum. In particular, endless debates about how the Romans managed to hoist an awning over the full length of the interior of the Colosseum, which apparently was done. But some of the elements of how the space was used are similar to things we've seen in the case of, for instance, the Ludi Scaenici, and could be said too about the way in which the spaces within circuses are used. For instance, seating was often designated or divided according to class, with the seating for the highest class, the senatorial class, being closest to the front. Maybe not quite as demarcated in terms of all of the rows of the seating as the theatre would, but still some representation within the formation of the audience of the social structure and the social hierarchy of Rome. To many, I think the arena games, the amphitheatrical games, seem very, very different from entertainments as we would understand them. Not simply in being, in large part, a blood sport, but their prominence in Roman society and the structure, both the industrial structure and the social structure around them. And it's important, I think, for us to think about what the meanings and the impact and the importance of these sorts of games within Roman society might have been. There are some simple things that can be said, of course. In these contexts, the populace was, at least in theory, and of course in practice that's in part, brought together. It was a bringing together of the community, whether it's circus, whether it's amphitheatre, and to some extent as well a theatre. They were sharing in and participating in a shared spectacle, a shared activity, even if we might think of it as somewhat passive. It was also an occasion, as in all of the entertainments, the ludi and the games we've discussed, where social status is very much on display. It's experienced indeed by the audience themselves, given the way that the seating is structured and allocated in many cases, but even more than that, given the emphasis, and again it is from an aristocratic point of view, but the repeated emphasis and concerns indeed around the status of the performers, and particularly the lowly, the slave status, or the infamous nature of each participant. So we have this emphasis on the difference between the watchers, the audience, and the watched, the performers. The watchers are the rulers, they're the people of Rome, if not indeed those who rule Rome itself. They're the rulers, they're the powerful, whereas the watched are the ruled, they're the enslaved, or In the case of criminals, they're the condemned. There is a very important differentiation of power going on here, and to think about what that means for the affirmation of Rome itself and the Roman community, rather than simply, although it's an important part of it, rather than simply being an entertainment offered to bring the masses enjoyment and therefore accrue favour to the emperor or whoever is putting on the games. There's maybe some deeper meanings and some deeper effects of these forms of games, and particularly the ways in which they're structured socially, but also in terms of the actual nature of the events and participants for Rome and Roman identity in a more general sense.